with that, I'm going to start with just some global trends that are really starting to affect our industry. And I think that we've heard quite a bit about the issue of plastic pollution, and we've heard from some folks in industry that are also trying to use recycled materials. So what I would like to do with you is to sort of set the big stage in terms of where the motivation's coming from and how can we participate in that in such a way so that we can really push these in the right direction. So starting with sort of drivers, what makes a company want to be better? And how can we get them to embrace sustainability much more broadly than having it be just that department that's down the hall? And sometimes I tell the story of when I was with Alcan Packaging, and I was responsible for R&D for many, many years. And people used to run away from me when they would see me coming to get money. And they would say, oh, no, she's going to want more money. Well, they ran faster when I moved into sustainability. And so the issue really here is how do we create that engagement? And I think there are two things, or well, there's many things, but sort of at the macro level, the circular economy and sustainable materials management, things that you hear often, businesses starting to embrace both, having that conversation about why it's better for the long-term viability of their business to be more sustainable and trying to turn that into economic terms that they can really understand. So that's really key, is the movement that's starting to take place within our corporations, recognizing the value of doing the right thing. Then we've talked a lot about ocean plastic pollution, so I'm not really going to dwell on that very much this morning. But then I also want to talk about the rise of voluntary corporate accountability, because there are some comments about our federal government earlier today, and corporations are really stepping up, I think, to fill the gap. Cities, towns, and states are absolutely doing great work. But companies, too, are starting to drive change. I know with the Paris Accord, many of our members, we're all in. We're not changing. And some of the exciting things that are coming from these members is we'll meet those commitments anyway. So that's a good thing. Food waste has been talked about a little bit. I want to touch on that. And then I also want to talk about this whole issue of end market collapse. In the last session, we heard a little bit more about China and the fact that they're not going to take our materials anymore. This is really serious. And we have to, I think, encourage our cities and towns and places where we live to stay the course and not give up. Because if we stop collecting and we start landfilling those materials in the interim, it's going to take, I just don't even want to think about that. So that's not a possibility. So here, this is a concept that I really like, and I only recently learned about it. It's a woman named Kate Raworth who has worked with Oxfam for many years, and the idea behind donut economics is that if we're thinking at a global level, we have our planetary boundaries that we can't exceed, whether that's carbon, whether that's water, whether that's nitrogen, whether that's biodiversity, and those things all work as a system. But we also have our basic human rights, and so the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that creates this donut of a safe operating space where part of the world has to get better. Those of us that use more resources than we really need have to figure out a way to do that better so that we can continue to operate in this safe operating space. And so some companies are really starting to embrace this concept of donut economics, and I think that that's a positive thing to look for what's the ceiling and what's the floor. The other issue is the circular economy, and is the circular economy sustainable? And this is a really interesting debate, and I think the comments about Coca-Cola earlier in the day help us illustrate this concept of, do we go for carbon efficiency or do we go for recycling? And Coca-Cola has stated publicly that their goal is the carbon footprint of the drink in your hand. And if that's their goal, then it makes perfect sense that they're pursuing biopolymers, because the biopolymer has a much lower carbon footprint than the recycled container. Other companies will look to recycling as being a better solution. We need both. We need to be cognizant of the carbon footprint of what we're trying to do. There's a new issue of Industrial Ecology specifically devoted to the circular economy, and it has a number of thoughtful papers on how do we make the decisions to, do we recycle even if it costs more carbon in certain instances? How do we make those decisions? How do we create that system? So how do we balance recycling, carbon intensity, consumption, and the different types of loops, whether they're closed loops, so going back directly into a bottle, or going into something else, such as decking or other markets. And those are all really good things that we're going to have to work towards understanding better. And then my last sort of comment on this is you hear a number of debates about this in terms of carbon efficiency versus recyclability. And they're both really good lenses that we have to start to use better. I don't see them as an either or. I see them as working together to help us move forward. So as far as plastics and the ocean, one of the things that I've been trying to do is socialize this idea that oftentimes we use euphemisms and we talk about leakage or marine debris, when really we have to talk about garbage in the ocean, and we have to really call it what it is. So and I know there were a number of other talks, but this idea that most of this is land-based and we need infrastructure. Well, why is it getting in the ocean in the first place? Because there's no value at this stage, because we haven't created a pull-through. This is back to end markets. So if we had end markets for this material, it wouldn't be sitting in big piles in different countries in Asia ready to go into the ocean at the first storm that comes by. So we really have a responsibility towards thinking about how are we going to create this pull and create these end markets so that they're substantial. And I think what the conversation from Denton Plastics, I mean, it's amazing. And all the different areas that they're working to incorporate recycled material, we need 1,000 more of Denton Plastics to start using this material, because basically if we even think about polyethylene film, there's so much polyethylene film that the price of virgin film is extremely low, and we're not using as much as we could be using. So we have to do a better job at creating that pull-through, and that will help us get the garbage out of the ocean. And so this is my tongue-in-cheek take on EPA's recycling hierarchy, and I have added the ocean as the least desirable place where our materials can end up. So what's starting to happen? And this is this issue of really two big areas. Carbon footprint commitments. And recycled material oftentimes has a much lower carbon footprint. Biopolymers are even lower, but recycled material has a lower carbon footprint than virgin materials. And so when this is the case, companies that are counting, the idea of having a lower carbon footprint becomes an important driver in getting companies to create end markets and use recycled content. So a number of companies here that have made carbon commitments. The biggest one is Walmart with Project Gigaton. So my understanding is a gigaton of carbon is about the amount of carbon that Germany puts in the atmosphere in a year, and Walmart is trying to take that out of their supply chain. Huge project concentrating on a number of areas, obviously agriculture, anything with a plug, but packaging is a big piece of Project Gigaton, and their aim to try to make packaging more recyclable and have recycled content in their packaging. So Project Gigaton, big driver, and when Walmart starts working with their supply chain, that is really significant in terms of all the people that they can get engaged in a project that might not have been willing to engage otherwise. Mars, this one just happened a couple weeks ago, pledging $1 billion to fight climate change. Again, some of these companies really stepping up, creating drivers, and I think this was the year of new goals. You had Walmart, Pepsi, Unilever, also Target, upping their goals from maybe 10 years ago. These are their new sets of goals where they really are focused in many ways on recyclability. That becomes an issue because we can make things more recyclable, and I'm going to talk about our How to Recycle Label program in a few minutes, and helping companies understand what they do to packaging that takes a perfectly good material and makes it less recyclable. The next step is recycled content. And so whether that is supported by regulation, helping companies create a level playing field with recycled content, whether it's by us as consumers. Companies know that consumers like recyclable packaging. What we have not demanded yet is recycled content. So we can do that. But that's really the next step, is to help create that market. And Target is kind of unique in the sense that one of their brand new goals is to create end market demand. That's the first time I've ever seen a goal like that. So that's kind of a really cool start. Lots of other companies have recycling commitments as well. So I also want to touch on composting and some of the work that the Sustainable Packaging Coalition is doing, and also the Composting Collaborative, which is a new initiative. Sego's very involved in that, and Susan and others, which right now it's really just an industry collaboration to think about composting, but from our end to help educate. Our perspective is compostable packaging is really critical to getting food waste into the compost. But as Susan will tell you, not all packaging is created equal, and it creates really big problems. And so what we do not want to happen is our composting infrastructure to start to develop in North America and have packaging be excluded. So really working hard to ensure that packaging is part of the solution. And this is just a simple chart, some work that we did at events. Charlotte Driesen, who works with us, did this work looking at a number of events that were aiming for increasing their diversion. And if they only recycled, they got about 24% diversion. If they recycled and composted food, but didn't compost the packaging, didn't have compostable packaging, they got about 55%. They went up to 81% if they had compostable packaging. So it was absolutely huge in terms of improving the diversion. And one of the things that I had heard from EPA is that if we could get all of our food waste out of the landfill, we would meet our Paris Accord agreement. Now, that's not going to happen, but given all the food that we put in landfill that then produces methane, if we could just do that, it would take us significantly towards meeting those commitments. So this is really important. So, what about recycling economics and end market volatility? So one of the reasons that we have an issue is because we have a huge oversupply of virgin capacity. That's due to the low price of oil, and it's also due to the abundance of natural gas due to fracking. And because of that, you're seeing an increase, significant increase in polymer production in North America and elsewhere in the world. So what that does is it depresses the price for recycled material. Now we're layering on top of that the China green fence. The other thing that's happened is the cost of processing municipal waste has changed, because as we use less and less paper, a lot of people say, well, what funds our recycling systems? And they'll say, oh, aluminum cans. They fund it. You get $1,200 a ton. It's really good stuff. Well, it's only 1.5%, maybe 2% of the stream. So what carries the backbone of our recycling facilities today is paper. It's corrugate and mixed paper. So with that, and also PET, but as PET gets lighter and as newspaper gets less, then we have less value for our commodity materials in our recycling system, and that just exacerbates the problem even more. And then, of course, a strong US dollar. So what do we do about all of this? One of the things, we have a partnership with the Recycling Partnership, and that's also another great organization for small communities or large communities to work with in terms of helping reduce contamination and increasing the effectiveness of recycling. We joined forces with them about a year ago and started, it's a crazy acronym, ASTRIX, which is really just Applied Systems Approach for Recycling. And what we did, and this is really, we had to do this to support our How to Recycle label, which I'll explain a little more about in a minute, but we broke the recycling system down into 5 major elements. And we kind of flipped it. We started with end markets. I wouldn't normally start there. I'd normally start with the consumer, saying you've got to have the consumer educated in order to do the right thing, give them the information so that they know what to do, and they have to be motivated to actually put it in their bin. Then we have our collection system. Then it has to sort. When it gets to that municipal recycling facility, you have to be able to sort it, and it has to be able to go where it needs to go. And our recycling facilities were often set up for a very different mix of materials than we have today. Then you have to be able to reprocess it. There were some comments earlier about contamination. So one of the things from a sortation point of view is, and this is kind of a conundrum, if you have something like a black plastic, it is a great recipient for recycled content or recycled material because it's black, but you can't see black on a sorting belt. So it's very difficult to sort black plastic in a municipal recycling facility. A PET sleeve on a plastic bottle, you can't identify what resin it is. So there's lots of work going on trying to help improve labels in particular so that we can improve sortation. And then we get to end markets, and again, how critical those end markets are. So some bright lights on reprocessing. There has been a lot of movement in chemical recycling. When I was in the PET industry, which was probably 15 years ago today, chemical recycling was just starting, and then it stopped for a number of years, and mechanical recycling really took over. But with recent announcements from Unilever and also from Procter & Gamble that are setting up chemical recycling plants, Unilever's is in Indonesia, and it's aimed at those polyethylene sachets or the multi-layer sachets that they're trying to take those back to straight polyethylene. In emerging economies, sachets are a real litter problem, and it's mainly because consumers have to buy small quantities of items, so they all come in these little individual sachets. So chemical recycling is definitely an answer, and I see it as a spectrum of what do we need, and when you're doing chemical recycling, it's not just an A or a B. There's all different types of intermediates that one can make or create. So. Yeah, so taking the polymer back into its precursor parts, and you can take it all the way back into those materials that made it, or you can take it part of the way back. And so one of the things that Procter & Gamble is talking about is with their facility, they're going to be chemically processing it so that they can get color and other additives out of it. Because one of the things with polypropylene is that everybody wants clear to use as a recycle feedstock, but nobody wants their container to be clear. So if you think of all the different shampoos that are in polypropylene bottles, they're every color of the rainbow. So colors and adhesives become a real problem. So P&G's process, supposedly it's not, they've only said very few things about it, but the idea is to take that color out so that then you have a neutral polymer to start with. So there's activity there, research activity. On the sortation side, the Association of Plastic Recyclers was mentioned earlier. They're working on a sortation protocol that will help us understand how things sort. This is 2D versus 3D. It's large versus small. It's different shapes, but helping us get better at understanding what will sort, what won't sort, and what could we do differently in order to sort better. Robotics, there's lots of new robotics coming in. The robots themselves aren't new, but what is new and what's exciting is machine learning. And those robots are able to learn what packaging looks like and pick out very specific things. And I got to go to a facility in Omaha where they had one of these AMP robotic arms, and it was just amazing watching it go for very specific things at a relatively fast speed. And then we have Canada, which has a container sorting facility just outside of Vancouver, and that's really the first facility of its kind that's really highly specialized to sort all different types of plastic container. And the better you can sort those materials, the better chance you have of creating markets for those materials. So SPC, when we think of sustainable packaging, we think of putting it into 4 different areas. We think of sourcing, so that can be anything from certified or recycled or bio-based content. We think of material health, making sure that there's nothing in that packaging material that's going to be a threat to material health. We think of optimizing, only use as much as you need, and then recovery. So those are kind of the principles that we try to educate our members from a sustainable perspective. So One of the programs that we have developed is the How to Recycle label. And the idea behind this label is how do we help consumers know what's recyclable and what isn't recyclable, especially when you have look-alike packaging. This was intended to cut through the clutter for consumers and to help them recycle better. But the unintended consequence of this label has been educating the brands on what they do to perfectly good packaging that makes it unrecyclable. And the reason that they're willing to work with us is that they recognize that getting the better label, the widely recycled label versus a not yet recycled or a check locally, has brand value. So it has really motivated a number of changes. So if we think of something like a mailer or a PET clamshell, the second you put a paper label on it, you just took a material that is recyclable and you made it unrecyclable. So helping people understand that those types of things and making those small changes can really make a big difference in terms of contamination. So the label is rolling out. It really has started to hit critical mass this year, and that's because we've had some folks like Kellogg's and General Mills and Target that have been with us from the beginning, but Walmart came in about a year ago and required that all suppliers to their own brand products use the How to Recycle label, and that has caused an absolute explosion in the label. So for those of you that haven't seen the label, it's composed of two, or it can be multiple icons. It's iconic. It explains what the material is, what the shape is, and whether it's widely recycled. This is a cereal box. So it tells you that the paper box is widely recycled, and it tells you that you can take that inner liner with your grocery bags to store drop-off. We've partnered very closely with the WRAP program. I know Keith is here from ACC, and we've worked with them on their recycling program for plastic bags and trying to ensure that things like the air pillows that you get in your Amazon shipments, Sealed Air was one of the very first to put the store drop-off label on that to help consumers that wanted to do something with their plastic films, bread bags, dry cleaning bags. Any of those films are compatible with that polyethylene recycling stream. And where we do the testing is we end up going to places like Trex and Novalex in order to ensure that the materials can go through their systems. So the label helps with knowledge and behavior. We know from the Carton Council that 67% of consumers assume that a package is not recyclable if they don't see information on the label, and that 57% look to the package first for recycling information. 84% of consumers say that they learn. This is a survey that we do yearly and consumers can participate in. And then they tell us how they're changing behavior. So looking that they can recycle more accurately, or they've recycled more, or they understood that they could recycle something that they hadn't been able to recycle before. How to Recycle helps with package design. That's the idea that I mentioned before, that brands are being able to have these conversations with their suppliers, and they have to fill out for us what the package is actually made of. And so sometimes what we found is that in some cases, people didn't really know. And going back and having them have to specify what's in this, is there a barrier, what else is part of this package, has been really helpful in starting those dialogues to help us make packaging more recyclable. So within every label is a custom recyclability assessment. So that's really become where the value is. And I don't have any slides on this here, but we are also starting to work with Susan and others on, we have a How to Compost label. And that's really in its infancy, but the idea there is that will also help people understand when something looks like it might be compostable or it might not be compostable. What if it's plastic? If it has the How to Recycle label on it, at least you can help distinguish between what is or what isn't recyclable. The way we come to the label is, first, it's a marketing claim. So the Federal Trade Commission weighs in on this with their green guides. We have studies that show if 60% or more consumers have access to recycling, then you can have a widely recycled label. If there's something on the product that contributes to its technical ability to be recycled, such as or sorted, then we would look at that and say, you know what, if it can't be technically recycled or it can't be sorted, then you can't put that widely recycled label on it. And here's the kicker that's not on this slide. FTC also says there has to be a market. You cannot deceive a consumer and have that consumer think that it's going into a recycling system, and then if it's getting landfilled or nothing's happening with it, that's deception. So we as a nation, now that China, and when everything went to China, that was a way. So that was okay, that was a market. It went somewhere. If it can't go there anymore, we have to develop those end markets so that we still have recycling. We rely very heavily on the Association of Plastic Recyclers as well as the Recycled Paperboard Alliance to tell us technically what's recyclable and what's not recyclable. And we also use the label to distinguish between look-alike packages. So you have something like this, you have two pouches. One's recyclable, one isn't. How's the consumer ever going to know and make that decision? Well, the label can help a consumer understand that. It can help reduce contamination. Here's another example of look-alike packages. One sprayer has metal parts, the other sprayer is all plastic. One's acceptable, one isn't acceptable. A consumer's never going to know that. So you're going to have to be able to tell them. And I think sort of the last couple of concepts that I wanted to leave us with is there's a lot more really good material. I try to think of sort of fringe versus core. And the core materials, we're not doing a great job of getting those materials. And we can do a much better job of getting the valuable materials. And the more, so think of the metals, think of PET, think of paper. If we can drive our systems to create value, then we're going to have a better chance at creating value from recycled products. Some challenges that are on the horizon. We talked a little bit about food waste and compostable packaging, the emerging role of biopolymers, real opportunity here. Meal kits. I don't know if any of you deal with meal kits, but there's an awful lot of packaging associated with the meal kits. I know I read an article recently that Amazon was talking about some shelf-stable meal kits, which would significantly reduce the refrigerated packaging required for those meal kit delivery programs. And of course, e-commerce is changing in some ways, and it really is just a new lens to think about how can we optimize packaging and ensure that we get that packaging back from the consumers. I mentioned that corrugate was very valuable, but we only get 30% of it back from consumers compared to what we would have gotten back from the grocery stores. So from that perspective, I hope that those are a few items to share with you, and look forward to questions, I guess, later. Yeah.